I worked for years repairing elevators. I entered them every day, climbed through the shafts, stayed suspended between floors with nothing besides a cable and my tool in my hand. You learn not to be afraid of heights. You learn not to be afraid of the dark. You learn to trust mechanics, because mechanics do not lie. A loose screw is a loose screw. A defective sensor is a defective sensor. Everything has an explanation. Everything has a solution. That logic kept me calm for years, until the day it stopped working. There is one specific elevator that I cannot get out of my head until today, not because it was the most dangerous one that I ever faced, not because I almost got hurt, but because until today I do not have an explanation for some things that happened inside there. And believe me, I tried. I tried a lot. The call came on a common afternoon. A company in an old building reporting that the basement elevator was behaving strangely. It stopped on random floors without anyone having called it. It opened the door in the middle of the route. Sometimes the door closed by itself while someone was still entering. In theory, routine technical problems. It could be the control panel, the door sensors, the call system with electrical interference, an afternoon job. But when I arrived at the building, the first thing that caught my attention was not the elevator. It was the reception security guard. He looked at me in a way that I was not used to receiving. It was not the normal indifference of someone accustomed to seeing technicians come and go. It was relief. The type of relief from someone who had been waiting for somebody to appear to deal with something that he himself did not want to deal with alone anymore. He led me through the hallway to the back area of the building, that concrete hallway that every large company has and that nobody uses unless they need to. Poorly lit, smell of old humidity, the type of place that makes the street noise disappear completely as you move forward. When we arrived at the steel door that gave access to the basement elevator, he stopped. He did not enter. He stayed there outside with his hand on the door frame and said, "It's this one." I asked if there was anything that I needed to know before starting. He stayed quiet. It was not the pause of someone thinking. It was the pause of someone weighing whether he was going to speak or not. Then he said, "I don't know. It's just that nobody uses this elevator anymore." Why? Because everyone who uses it comes out looking like they saw something. I thanked him, picked up my tool bag, and entered. The internal hallway was darker than the previous one. The lighting came from a single fluorescent tube on the ceiling, one of those already at the end of its life that flickers so slightly that you almost do not notice until you notice it, and then you cannot ignore it anymore. The elevator was at the end. The cabin was there, door closed, call panel lit with a yellowish light. I touched the button. There was a pause too long before anything happened. Then the door opened. I entered, stopped for 1 second before starting to work. Brushed metal cabin, mirror in the back taking almost the entire wall, fluorescent lighting flickering slightly, worn rubber floor with stains that were probably maintenance oil, a slight smell of metal and of something that I could not identify at the time. Closed, still, old. Nothing visually wrong. I opened the control panel, and that was when I noticed the first strange thing. The panel had marks of previous repairs. Many repairs. Replaced wires, substituted parts, resoldered connections by different hands with different approaches. This is normal in old equipment. You always find layers of interventions throughout the years, but the amount there was out of the ordinary. It looked like at least 4 or 5 different technicians had tried to repair that elevator at different moments, each attacking a different point, and none of them had reached a definitive conclusion. There was no maintenance history available. I worked with what I had. I started with the door sensors, cleaned the contacts, checked the alignment, tested the return signal, everything normal. I went to the call system, The floor buttons, the internal panel connections, also normal. I spent 1 hour working inside there, and during that hour, the door opened by itself 3 times. It was not wind. The hallway had no windows. There was no air current. The door mechanism simply activated without any signal on the control panel. No button had been pressed, no call had been registered. The door opened, stayed open for a few seconds, and closed. Technically, that should not be possible. I had disconnected the external call panel from the other floors precisely to work in an isolated way, without interference. But the door kept opening. I sat on the floor of the cabin with the panel in front of me and stayed looking at the connections, trying to find a pattern, something that explained why the opening signal was being generated from nowhere. That was when I looked at the mirror. For a fraction of a second, in the reflection, I saw the door behind me closed. I turned around. The door was open. I looked at the mirror again. In the mirror, the door was closed. In reality, open. I know how mirrors work. I studied physics. I know basic optics. A flat mirror does not distort reality. It replicates it. What you see in the mirror is what exists in front of you. There is no alternative version. There is no delay. There is no distortion of a closed door when the door is open. But I saw it, clearly, without ambiguity. I closed my tool bag, left the cabin, sat in the hallway. I stayed there for around 10 minutes, drank water, took deep breaths a few times, convinced myself that it was stress, tiredness, flickering fluorescent light, lack of sleep from a heavy week. The brain fills gaps. The brain creates patterns where they do not exist. That is science, not weakness. I got up and went back to the cabin. The second part was worse. I needed to check the machinery in the upper shaft, which stays above the cabin. I climbed through the emergency hatch in the ceiling with my helmet and my flashlight and went to inspect the cables, the counterweight, the traction motor. The interior of an elevator shaft is one of the strangest places where a human being can be. It is completely closed, completely vertical, and the noise that the machinery makes when it is stopped is different from everything else. It is not silence. It is an absence of sound with a presence that you feel more than hear, as if the space itself were under pressure. I was checking the condition of the main cable when I heard a sound coming from below, from the cabin. It was a specific creak, that sound of rubber flooring when a person is standing and slightly shifts the weight from one foot to the other. It is not the creak of something settling. It is the creak of something alive moving. I stayed completely still, holding the flashlight, listening. The sound continued for around 20 seconds, rhythmic, light, intermittent, like someone who was waiting. Then it stopped. I climbed down through the hatch. The cabin was empty, but the door was closed. I had not closed the door before climbing up. I never close the door when I am working in the shaft. It is a safety matter to be able to leave quickly if the machinery moves unexpectedly. The door was open when I climbed up. I'm sure of that. It was closed when I climbed down. And the mirror now showed the door closed, matching for the first time since I had entered with reality. I should have left. Anyone with common sense would have left. But there is one thing about technical work that people from outside do not understand. A problem without a solution is unbearable. Not because of ego, not because of stubbornness. It is almost physical. Like a stone inside your shoe that you know is there. You simply cannot close the file before understanding what was happening. So I continued. The last stage was checking the pit, the space below the cabin where the end-of-travel shock absorbers stay. You request the cabin to rise to the top floor, climb down a metal ladder fixed to the wall of the shaft, and work underneath the cabin structure with around 2 meters of space. I sent the command through the manual service control. The cabin went up. I climbed down the ladder. The pit is a space that changes you inside, even if you do not notice it. Concrete on all sides, the metallic structure of the cabin visible up there. Your flashlight being the only source of light. the only sound being your own breathing. You are, in that moment, more isolated from the outside world than in any other place where you have ever been. I was checking the shock absorbers when I felt the air change. It is difficult to explain this type of thing without sounding crazy, but whoever works in confined spaces long enough develops a sense for variations in air pressure. When a large door opens somewhere nearby, you feel it before hearing it. When heavy machinery is about to move, there is a change in the environment before the movement itself. I felt that change, and 2 seconds later, the cabin came down. It was not fast. It was not a fall. It was a controlled descent, exactly as if someone had pressed the basement button inside the cabin. It descended with precision, fit into the shock absorbers, and locked. 2 handspans away from my head. The manual service control was hanging from my own belt. I had not activated anything. The floor call panel had been disconnected since the beginning. There was no technical reason for that cabin to have descended. But it descended. I stayed in the pit, with the iron structure centimeters from my head, in almost complete darkness. I heard the machinery stabilize. I heard the mechanical silence return. And then I heard, coming from inside the cabin right above me, the same sound from before. Footsteps. Someone moving inside a cabin that had no way of having anyone inside. I climbed the ladder, not because I wanted to enter the cabin again, because it was literally the only exit from the pit. Each step vibrated slightly under my weight. I climbed slowly, without making noise, which is completely irrational, because if there is someone inside there, they certainly already know that I am here. But instinct commands, and instinct in that moment was telling me to make the least noise possible. I reached the height of the cabin floor. The door was closed. I looked through the gap under the door, and I saw a shadow on the cabin floor. The fluorescent light projected the shadow strangely on the dark rubber floor, and I tried for 1 second to convince myself that it was a distortion from my flashlight, a lighting artifact, anything rational. But the shadow moved. Slowly. Only 2 or 3 centimeters. The displacement of weight from someone standing still and slightly changing position. I did not breathe for almost half a minute. Then I placed my hand on the door. Pushed. The cabin was empty. The mirror showed the empty cabin. The floor door was closed. No sound. No presence. Nothing. I grabbed my tool bag, went up to the reception without stopping. I told the security guard that I needed more information about the elevator history before continuing anything. He nodded as if he had been expecting me to say exactly that, as if everyone who went to that elevator came back saying the same thing. I left the building. 3 days later, I called the company to give a formal response and understand the history of the equipment. The woman who answered stayed quiet for a moment when I mentioned the basement elevator. Then she said that the equipment had been interdicted. I asked if it was because of the problems that I had reported. Not exactly, she said. During a routine inspection of the building, they had found old documentation referring to that elevator. The building had changed owners years earlier, and in the transition process, the basement elevator had been kept without any review of the history. There was a previous interdiction document from an administration that no longer existed, signed by someone who no longer worked in that sector, and the reason stated only preventive interdiction, unspecified reason. Nobody knew the reason for the original interdiction. The document had no details. It only had the date, the signature, and that sentence. But she said one last thing before ending the call. During the recent inspection, when they examined the interior of the cabin in more detail, they found marks on the ceiling, on the emergency hatch specifically. Marks that had been made from inside the cabin on the hatch fittings with fingers, as if someone had been trying to push the hatch outward from inside with a lot of force for a long time. I never went back to that building. I do not know what happened to the elevator afterward. I do not know the real reason for the original interdiction. I do not know who made those marks on the ceiling trying to open the emergency hatch from inside and for how long they kept trying. What I do know is that there is a type of discomfort that technical logic does not solve. You check every connection, every sensor, every wire, and everything is correct on paper. But the door opens without command. The cabin descends without signal. The mirror shows a reality different from yours, and you hear footsteps where there is nobody. I worked with elevators for years. I entered shafts at 3 in the morning, repaired cabins stuck between floors with people screaming inside, stayed suspended on cables with a 20-floor drop below me. I learned to separate what is real from what is fear. But this specific elevator, I do not enter anymore. Not because I do not know what was there, but because some things you simply decide that you do not need to know until the end. Some elevators transport more than people, and some doors you learn are not worth opening.